Hi folks, today we're going to be assessing privacy risk with the IPA Triad. Before we begin, my name is Mark. I could describe myself as a few different things, but largely I've just worked on a huge variety of projects, coming from a decade of software engineering before my shift in focus to security and privacy. Today I run a small consultancy called Obscure Group, and before that I was a privacy engineer at Google, providing consulting to their hardware product teams and marketing groups. And before then, I was doing product security at Square, working with all their products. Before that, I was working on Square's Blue Team, building detection tools and incident response pipelines. And before then, I was a founding member of the Square Capital product team. Now, before all of that, I was working at a variety of small to medium-sized tech companies, building products and services in advertising, social networking, e-commerce, collaboration tools, etc. Overall, I built up a skill set that's been really helpful for jumping into complex new spaces, assessing what needs to be done, and moving on to the next problem. So today I wanted to share a few tools that will hopefully help you when you're jumping into complex privacy problems so that you can address them and similarly move on. So we have a few different sections today. I'm just going to dive right into the introduction. And I wanted to give you a different perspective on privacy. But first, let's learn from our colleagues in security. What does it mean to be secure or not secure? Well, there's a concept known as the CIA Triad, which is considered one of the key concepts used to describe what qualities must be protected in order to consider the information wholly secure in principle. In summary, confidentiality is about exposure risk, integrity is about tamper risk, availability is about resource denial risk. And having these different properties has been really helpful in having more nuanced risk discussions and analysis rather than just saying something is secure or not secure. So great, but what does it mean to be private or not private? Well, there's a bunch of different approaches to this depending on where you're coming from. You can jump into data protection concepts like collection, processing, transparency, consent, and control. But sometimes it feels like rushing to standard solutions when you don't really have a bigger picture of what you're trying to protect. You can talk about what users care about and what they personally find creepy or clearly compromising their own privacy. But these assumptions really vary a lot between individuals and communities, and user expectations are also highly subject to their lived experiences, technical literacy, and access to meaningful data about how their information is used. We can consider the motives and means various attackers would seek to compromise others' privacy, but attack surfaces and techniques are constantly changing, and that can make it really difficult to maintain a collective understanding and language to describe privacy this way. So, coming from security, I wanted a way to describe properties of privacy, and what I ended up with was identity, presence, and activity. Let's just dive right into these. Identity is about data that reveals who it's about. So things like a full name, a date of birth, social security number can be attributed to an individual. Or when you're talking about a group, it could be a member of a household, employee of a company, being part of a social circle of some sort. Or whether you're talking about some larger population like a nationality, gender, age group, religion. Now for presence, this is really about data that reveals where someone has been. Not necessarily who they are, but just that a human was there at some point. And here's an example of some things that can return data that indicate human presence at a given point in time. Now, activity is about data that reveals what happened at a given point in time. And so here's some examples below that show, data about, what somebody was doing while they wore an activity monitor, or maybe as they used an app or made a purchase, what behavioral data they generated, or what hardware can sense the environment around them to detect activities in some unique, interesting way. You may have spotted something now from the previous examples. It's actually rare to find data that doesn't involve multiple properties or expose another property via inferences. And that's pretty similar to how the CIA Triad works in practice too. For example, if an attacker subverts the confidentiality of a credential, they could use it to log into a system and modify and delete data, which could affect integrity and availability. Here's a Venn diagram of various subsets of how data can be of multiple properties. When you're smack dab in the middle, it kind of means that you're seen from all sides. It's about who you are, what you're doing, and where you are. A good example of this is a video camera. They're all around us these days, and they're pretty high sensitivity on all three scales. So yeah, you see them in doorbells, security cameras, in your phone, all over the place. Authenticated interactions. Now, before when I talked about behavioral data describing various activities you might do, a lot of time they're tied to your identity explicitly via some user identifier or some session that you have in that context. And in this case, somebody is making a payment, which is linked to your identity and often a place in the real world. So this is also all three, at least in theory. Badge entry systems are also an authenticated interaction, which encompass a couple different properties. Let's dive into how we perform risk assessments using a qualitative approach. There's a general methodology I'm just going to introduce here. It's about averaging three things: severity, scope, and likelihood. And the impact becomes the shorthand for the overall negative privacy effect to be avoided. Severity. It's informed by sensitivity or the damage potential, i.e., what is the harm experienced? In this picture, a squirt gun is shown, and this might be considered a mild annoyance to most people, maybe less so if you're replacing a circuit breaker or operating heavy machinery, but that's out of scope. In more extreme cases of severity, the outcome might be injury or death. Now, scope is about a pool of a population or users or systems or whatever you're trying to protect. And here I'm showing a drop of water, but to you this might mean a handful of users using a subset of your application. In more extreme examples, the scope could be every single user, past and present. Moving on to likelihood, it's informed by the number of steps or the complexity for the risk to be realized. The practice of threat modeling is extremely useful for determining likelihood since it involves deeper knowledge of the design, the implementation, or the operation details. Now, in this example, you can interpret the baby puzzle metaphor either way. If solving it means the risk is realized, then you could consider the likelihood pretty high. Now, if you interpret the design more literally, in that a baby puzzle is harder to lose pieces, break during use, or accidentally swallow a piece, then you might consider the risk likelihood being low. In a complex system, the metaphor can also be taken in a couple directions. For example, if realizing the risk requires highly specialized knowledge, tools, preconditions, then the likelihood might be considered low. Alternatively, if you consider to have the overall system be complex, prone to various types of failures, and have a larger attack surface, then you might actually consider the likelihood high. So what does using this methodology look like as a bunch of potential outcomes? Well, for those who are more visual learners, here's basically a table of all the potential outputs. And if you find the intersect here with low severity, medium scope, and high likelihood, we find that we have a medium impact. With a little bit of practice, you can pretty much do this in your head. And if the impact ever feels overstated or understated, it's a good indicator that one of your inputs was improperly assessed. But sometimes risks are more complicated, and in those cases, it's important to contextualize your risk impact and state the assumptions you've made. As a side note, if your severity, scope, or likelihood is none, your impact is always none. So here's how I suggest you use the IPA Triad properties. I suggest you use them to inform risk severity via the inferred data sensitivity. This should be somewhat intuitive here, but an example of something I would consider to be a high identity sensitivity could be like biometrics, video footage, that sort of thing. I'll move on for time's sake, though. Let's go into some exact use cases where I found the IPA Triad to be helpful. Developer APIs. So there is a lot of different ways to authorize users. I'm going to loosely describe what it means to be an OAuth provider, but I'll let you know the same principles can be applied elsewhere. Now, developer APIs basically provide third-party access to user data, and typically through resources that allow you to either create, read, update, or delete records. And historically, at least from what I've seen, most companies usually consider read to be the least sensitive permission, since create, update, and delete are really the primary targets for attackers to cause operational disruption for your users. These would be like integrity or availability attacks. But this laid-back approach is how you get yourself into a Cambridge Analytica situation where attackers are actually using your read APIs to silently slurp up user data for their own malicious uses. And when you're not careful in this regard, it's really hard to walk back from without thoughtful assessments and long-term API deprecation roadmaps, where users end up at risk until the APIs change, which can take a while. So it's better to design it right up front. So this is what the typical authorization process looks like, but the important thing to note is that a user can grant multiple permissions. In addition, each permission can grant access to numerous developer API resources, each with varying sensitivity. So what I recommend you do if you're building out your own developer APIs is that you really assess the resources that you're providing, using the risk assessment methodology I described to better understand the privacy risk to your users. And this is a great opportunity to review other risks as well, like financial or operational or abuse. And once you've done that, you can pretty much just generate a spreadsheet formula to calculate your aggregate risk sensitivity across resources to really tell you what a permission scope's risk is. But I do stress that it's important to take a step back and look at the bigger picture revealed by all the data. Does one resource have a low identity sensitivity, but another one have a high identity sensitivity? And together, do they allow really strong correlations that now expose a strongly identified individual's presence or activities? These can be really useful insights as well. Then I recommend you de-risk your platform by applying the principle of least privilege to your users' data. You can take a permission scope that gives you access to way too many sensitive resources and break it into useful sub-permissions. And what's really important is even if you can't meaningfully change your permission structure, what you should really stress to do is to make sure that you're communicating the sensitivity of permissions to your users when they are granting other parties access to them. Because a lot of times users just click, yeah, sure, I'll allow it. I want the thing to happen. And they don't really understand what data access they're providing. Let's talk about device sensors, another use case. But before we do that, let's borrow another security concept, SideChannel attacks. And this is where you can use information to make inferences about sensitive data based on how you understand the device to work. So let's take a look at a few examples to see what kinds of information we can glean from raw, high-fidelity sensor data. Well, smartwatch-style heart rate monitors, from an identity perspective, they don't really return a lot of unique, interesting information, like something that would directly measure the heart, so that you can't really tell if anybody has like a heart abnormality, like a murmur, etc. But from a presence perspective, the fact that you have a pulse is a pretty high sign that there's somebody on the other end of that device. And also during physical exertion, heart rate is known to go up. So a lot of these things are advertised as activity monitors. And so yes, you can get the activity information from these readings. GPS. If these are on all the time, chances are the owner is going to return to their home. So that's a pretty identifiable piece of information. Sometimes addresses are listed in public records. If the device hasn't moved in a while, it may not actually be a good signal of whether or not there's a human present. But if it's moving, chances are there's a human attached to it. Now, if the device is known to be somewhere like a restaurant, a gym, a shopping mall, a place of worship, maybe an adult bookstore or a healthcare clinic, you might be able to infer some kind of activities of that person. So from an activity perspective, this data is interesting as well. Air quality sensors. Well, these ones are interesting because they don't tell you a whole lot about someone's identity. Maybe a stretch, but maybe someone with a lot of perfume might trip the volatile organic compound sensors. But I think that's, who can say without actual testing? Depending on placement, they can actually pick up human movements pretty well based on like an unusual disturbance of patterns in what you're seeing in the ambient environment. Otherwise, you might have to infer presence via other activity. Now, air quality sensors are interesting in that they can react significantly to activities like opening a door or a window, or cooking a meal on the stove, or taking a shower, or lighting a cigarette. So they do expose some information that I think most people wouldn't guess. So what do we do to protect sensor data? Well, you get creative and you think about what you could possibly do with the raw information. There's a lot of research out there about how you can use hardware sensors for various purposes. Check it out even if the implications haven't reached your product domain yet. So the most important thing I think you can do is to isolate processing so the data never leaves the device. That way you fully minimize your data exposure risk. But what's also important too is that the user knows under what circumstances data does leave their device and give them control over it. I think there's a lot of people who don't trust microphone embedded devices and perceive them to be always recording, even if they're just keeping a local stored buffer and occasionally sending relevant pieces to the cloud. I think that there's a lot of expectations users have about stuff that stays on devices that just isn't fully there yet. If you can't do everything on device, the next best thing you can do is degrade the signal as much as usably possible to minimize inferences of other activities or important information. So going back to something like a radar sensor, like Wi-Fi, that's really interesting because you can basically get a good 3D picture of the world around you. And so something you can do that's helpful is you can, instead of returning continuous data, maybe return information at more discrete intervals that make it harder to tell exact movements. And so that can decrease your activity sensitivity from that data. Other things you can do is you can, let's say, return less precise data. So can something like a radar sensor be sent at like a lower resolution or some less precise amount. And that way you couldn't see someone's body shape, which might be an indicator of their identity if you already know that about them. So yeah, you can definitely minimize identity sensitivity from that data as well by obfuscating these characteristics through introducing noise or removing precision. One example, I'm just blown away with how location tracking still works today when it comes to GPS in particular. So many people don't really need to share anything beyond their zip code in order for apps to localize. But for the most part, when people consent to share their location, it's giving very precise coordinates, and risk has not been minimized yet in the degree it should be. Well, what else can we do with this data? That's all the time we have for today, but there's probably a bunch of projects where applying the IPA Triad might be helpful for you. If you end up doing something really interesting, let me know. It would really make my day. If you have a question about these slides or a project you want to discuss, feel free to reach out, and thank you.